And that was, again, something that she apologized for. Yeah, and she give her credit for actually coming out to do that. But again, I think the larger state, the larger idea of what she's trying to say is something that she will defend, and a lot of people on the left wing will defend here to the end. I think it's very important and very critical, really critical, to call these people out on their lies of saying, okay, like that these like that Omar and Tlaib and others support anti-Semitism and support just hatred of Jews, when they've clearly come out time and time again and announced it. And there's a strong difference between that one way or the other. All right. We are a little bit short for time, but we're going to speed through one really quick story. As a media bloodbath at Vice has continued, as Vice's media CEO, Nancy Dubuque, has planned to tighten spending and achieve profitability, which will include laying off 10% of the organization's staff. Ooh, that is rough. That means roughly a loss of 250 jobs from the company's 2,500 member staff. An internal email that opened with several laudatory paragraphs of Vice's recent accomplishments. Dubuque then announced the layoffs. So that is very, very tough stuff for the great people really at Vice. Yeah, so it's, yeah, all the people who have been laid off. Obviously, we hope that we see, it's really tough. I really could get more into this issue of digital media and journalism and that stuff. But it's, yeah, we were really kind of cramped for time, and that's something I think worth doing somewhat of a special about, because what giant corporations are doing to journalism on a broad scale is very, very disturbing. We now move on to a great story in The Intercept by the John Schwartz, the man, about Elliot Abrams. It begins on December 11th, 1981, in El Salvador. A Salvadoran military unit created and trained by the U.S. Army began slaughtering everyone they could find in a remote village called El Mozote. Before murdering the women and girls, the soldiers raped them repeatedly, including as young as 10 years old, and joked that their favorites were 12-year-olds. One witness describes a soldier tossing a 3-year-old child into the air and doing some pretty... just so you know, I apologize. I should have warned for anyone who's listening, but maybe like kids in the car or something like that. Very, again, graphic stuff here. So one witness actually described the soldier tossing a 3-year-old child into the air and impaling him with his bayonet. Jesus. The final death toll was over 800 people. The next day was December 12th, and was the first day on the job for Elliot Abrams as an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs in the Reagan administration. Abrams snapped into action, helping to lead a cover-up of the massacre. News reports of what happened, Abrams told the Senate, were not credible, and the whole thing was being significantly misused as propaganda by anti-government guerrillas in the country. This past Friday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo named Abrams America's special envoy for Venezuela. According to Pompeo, Abrams will have responsibility for all things related to our efforts to restore democracy in the oil-rich nation. The choice of Abrams sends a clear message to Venezuela and the world. The Trump administration intends to brutalize Venezuela while producing a stream of unctuous rhetoric, just real frankly obnoxious rhetoric about America's love for democracy and human rights. Combining these factors, though, the brutality and the unctuousness is Abrams' core competency. Abrams previously served as multitude positions in Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush administrations, often with titles declaring their focus on morality. He was the State Department's human rights position, leader of the State Department's Human Rights Division, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations for the National Security Council under Bush, and George Bush's Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy in 2005-2009. In these positions, Abrams participated in some of the most ghastly acts of U.S. foreign policy over the past 40 years. From acts in South America to supporting the Iraq War, he is truly one of the leaders, probably if not the most successful military interventionist and war hawk this country has ever seen. Yeah. Jesus, it's pretty incredible. Abrams, he's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, joined the Reagan administration in 1981 at age 33. he received a promotion due to a stroke of luck. Reagan wanted to name Ernest Lefevre an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, but Lefevre's nomination was ran aground when two of his brothers revealed that he believed African Americans were inferior, quote, both intellectually speaking, inferior intellectually speaking, and disappointed Reagan was forced to turn to Abrams again as his second choice. A key Reagan administration concern at the time was Central America, in particular Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. They all have been dominated by tiny, cruel white elites since their founding, with a century's worth of help from U.S. interventions. In each country, the ruling families saw their society's other inhabitants as human-shaped animals who could be harnessed or killed as needed. So yeah, pretty much they were being ruled by just awful people who didn't have the best interests at mind at all of them, and they were pretty much installed, again, by the United States. But shortly after Reagan took office, Anastasio Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, had been overthrown by a socialist revolution. The Reaganites rashly saw this as a threat to the government of Nicaragua's neighbors. Each country had large populations who similarly did not enjoy being worked to death on coffee plantations or watching their children die of easily treated diseases. And then, again, one of the biggest things that leads to socialism is treatment like that. People were ready to take up pitchforks, and there's a whole mix of stuff from Abrams and his time in El Salvador. The extermination of El Mozote was just a drop in the river of what happened river of blood, what happened in El Salvador during the 1980s. About 75,000 Salvadorans died during what's called the Civil War, although pretty much all the killing was done by the government, and it's pretty much associated death squads. The numbers alone don't even tell the whole story. El Salvador is a small country, about the size of New Jersey. The equivalent amount of deaths in the U.S. would be 5 million people. So 5 million people dead because of someone else in your country coming in and assassinating these people. Insane. Criticism of the U.S. policy at the time was not confined to the left. During this period, Charles Makeling, who led the State Department planning for counterinsurgencies during the 1960s, wrote in the Los Angeles Times that he was supporting mafia-like oligarchies in El Salvador and elsewhere, was directly complicit in methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. So, yeah, comparing them to Nazis, some of their actions, which is insane. So, yeah, this is the guy who, again, was recently picked to lead the efforts in Venezuela. This is the guy who led all that at that time. The situation in Guatemala during the 1980s was much the same, and as were Abrams' actions. After the U.S. engineered the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president in 1954, and the country descended into a nightmare of revolving military dictatorships between 1960 and 1996, another civil war, where, quote, in quotes, 2,000 Guatemalans were killed, and that was brought to you by Dan Abrams. So the U.S. had to support the Guatemalan government, Abrams argued, because if we take the attitude, don't come to us until you're perfect, we're going to walk away from this problem until Guatemala has a perfect human rights record. Then we're going to be leaving in the lurch people who are trying to make progress. One example of the people who were really making an honest effort, according to Abrams, was Rios Montt. Rios Montt was found guilty in 2013 of committing genocide against the country's indigenous Mayans. So he was making a real effort, according to Dan Abrams, to bring some good progress. On the other hand, in Nicaragua, Abrams would become best known for his involvement in the Reagan administration's push to overthrow Nicaragua's revolutionary Sandinista government. He had advocated for a full invasion of Nicaragua in 1983, immediately after the successful U.S. attack on the teeny island nation of Grenada, when Congress cut off funds to the Contras, an anti-Sandinista guerrilla force created by the U.S. Abrams successfully persuaded the Sultan of Brunei to cough up $10 million for the cause. Unfortunately, Abrams, acting under the codename Kenilworth, provided the Sultan with the wrong Swiss bank account number, so the money was wired instead to a random person. So, $10 million random dollars for just going up to the random. So not only is he awful, but he's also incompetent, apparently. And by the way, he's also, typical in the Trump administration, got caught lying to Congress. He was questioned about his actions related to the Contras and lied voluminously. He later pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information. One was about the Sultan and his money, and another was about Abrams' knowledge of a Contra resupply C-123 plane that had been shot down in 1986. Yeah, a nice historical rhyme with a new job in the Trump administration. Abrams had previously attempted to obtain 2 C-123s for the Contras from the military in Venezuela. So yeah, they're all working together, and the band's getting back together pretty much. Yeah, so now over in Panama, before the America invaded Panama to oust Manuel Noriega in 1989, he was a close ally of the United States, despite the fact the Reagan administration knew he was a large-scale drug trafficker. He worked with Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel and everything else like that. So in 1985, Hugo Spadafora, a popular figure in Panama and the one-time vice minister for health, believed he obtained proof of Noriega's involvement in cocaine smuggling. He was on the bus on the way to Panama City when he was publicly seized by Noriega's thugs. And Noriega apparently gave, again, U.S. intelligence picked up Noriega giving his underlings the go-ahead to put Spadafora down like a rabid dog. They tortured Spadafora for a long night, and then they decapitated him while he was still alive. When Spadafora's body was found, his stomach was full of all the blood that he swallowed. So that is, again, very, very nice. This is really, that was horrific, so it got a lot of people's attention, but Abrams leapt to Noriega's defense, blocking the U.S. ambassador to Panama from increasing pressure on the Panamanian leader. When Spadafora's brother persuaded North Carolina hyper-conservative Jesse Helms to hold hearings on Panama, Abrams told Helms that Noriega was being really helpful to us, and it's not really a big problem. The Panamanians have promised that they're going to help with the Contras. If you have the hearings, it'll alienate them. So, yeah, Contras are supreme. Yeah, so that's not all. Abrams also engaged in malfeasance for no discernible reason. In 1986, a Colombian journalist named Patricia Lara was invited to the U.S. to attend a dinner honoring writers who had advanced inter-American understanding and freedom of information. When Lara arrived at New York's Kennedy Airport, she was taken into custody and then put on a plane back home. Soon afterwards, Abrams went on 60 Minutes to claim that Laura was a member of the ruling committees of M19, even though she was literally just a random journalist by the M19, the Colombia government guerrilla movement. She also, according to Abrams, was an active liaison between M19 and the Cuban secret police. So, again, just random stuff. Abrams' shameless deceptions wore down the American reporters. They said that black was white, or Washington Post reporter said at one point. Although I'd used all my professional resources, I had misled my readers, Omeng said another reporter. Omeng was so exhausted, this is one of the reporters here, by the experience that she quit her job. She quit her job trying to describe the real world to try and possibly write fiction. So that's what drove her to. Post-conviction, Abrams was seen as damaged goods who couldn't return to government. This underestimated him. Admiral William J. Crow Jr., the one-time chair of the Joint Chief of Staff, tangled fiercely with Abrams in 1989 over the proper U.S. policy toward Noriega once it became clear that he was more trouble than he was worth. Crow strongly opposed the bright idea that Abrams had come up with, the idea that the U.S. should establish a government in exile on Panamanian soil, which would require thousands of troops to withguard. But even though this idea was obviously incredibly blatantly stupid, Crow said of Abrams, "This snake's hard to kill," and boy was he right. He's back, and he's been through pretty much all the worst Republican administrations of the past, like, however many years, like 50, 30, 40 years. A lot of surprise of Washington's more naive insiders at Chris Hayes. Abrams was back soon after George W. Bush entered the White House. When you need to do an intervention, call Elliot Abrams. And guess what's going to happen? Guess what Trump did? So pretty much you get the idea. That this is again what all they did in Israel. I'm going to give you the stuff of what he did in Venezuela. By the beginning of 2002, Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez had become deeply irritating to the Bush White House, which was filled with veterans of battle of the 1980s. So they pretty much took all the Reagan people who did all the interventions in South America, brought them back, and Abrams was among them. Chavez was pushed out of power in a coup.